Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 48, with thunderous applause. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new member of the Patreon House of Lords, Earl Richard Davenport. If you'd like to join him and not only listen to the podcast ad-free but help support the show, then go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Thank you to all of my patrons. Last time, we saw the alliance between Republican MPs and the army, which deposed the Protectorate and brought back the Rump Parliament, almost immediately crash into a ditch. The army ejected the Parliament they'd only just restored, and then struggled to decide what to do. The Wallingford House junto, the grandees of the army in London, wanted to return to parliamentary rule, but without the risk that Parliament might do something that the army didn't like. Making matters worse for the junto, their junior officers wanted far more radical change, both politically and religiously. Within days of their coup, the junto faced resistance from all across Britain and Ireland, with the main danger coming from one of their own, General George Monck, Commander-in-Chief of the army in Scotland. Monck spent the rest of 1659 preparing to march into England. We left him at Coldstream, crossing the Anglo-Scottish border with his army, as news reached him that the junto had already fallen. The Rump Parliament was back. Monck had spent the previous 2 months telling everyone who would listen that all he wanted was the return of parliamentary rule, and he was not going to bring back the king. So today, we are going to see George Monck bring back the king. When Monck crossed into England on New Year's Day 1660, it looked like he had already won. 2 months before, the conflict between the Rump and the junto threatened to become a fourth civil war. But, as we saw last time, the grandees around Fleetwood and Desborough had rapidly lost legitimacy. It wasn't quite bloodless, but by Christmas Day, all the major strongholds in England, and the governments of Ireland and Scotland, had thrown off their authority. But there was still one man who was prepared to fight. John Lambert had not believed Monck's claims for a second. At best, he was weakening the Commonwealth in a play for personal power. At worst, he was planning to tear down the Republic, no matter what he promised. Lambert had left London at the head of a brigade in the first days of November, and they had marched north to block Monck's advance. But in contrast to the well-fed, well-paid, enthusiastic troops under Monck's command, Lambert was leading underfed, unpaid, and deeply unenthusiastic troops as they trudged north through the snow. They didn't want to fight their comrades for the sake of what exactly? Monck was championing the cause of Parliament and the good old cause. Hell, considering the lack of pay, they didn't want to fight at all. Some of them didn't even have shoes. Over the long march, the soldiers melted away. Soon, Lambert was near enough on his own. He turned around and went back to London, defeated without firing a shot. So, when Monck crossed the border, he faced no opposition. In fact, he sent word to Ireland that he didn't need the reinforcements they'd promised him. However, most of these soldiers had already set sail, and they arrived in northern England by the time Monck began his invasion. And while their commander went to confer with a demoralised Lambert, the rest of the force gathered at Marston Moor. You could not pick a more symbolic site for the parliamentary cause, except maybe Edge Hill. And here they met with, drumroll please, Thomas Fairfax. Yes, Fairfax is back in our story after several years of retirement. He'd stayed busy, governing the Isle of Man and writing bad poetry, but he'd mostly stayed out of politics. Mostly. He'd been an MP in Richard Cromwell's Parliament and argued against military rule. When the Protectorate was overthrown, he was elected to the restored Council of State, but he wanted nothing to do with it, and instead packed up and went back to Yorkshire. Since November, Fairfax had been in contact with Monck on behalf of the Yorkshire gentry. He informed the general that they were not enthusiastic about his pledges to restore the Rump Parliament. It was, after all, very unrepresentative. Now, they wanted the full Parliament of 1642, before Pride's Purge. Monck wrote back to his former Lord General and assured him that what he'd said in public was not his full intention. Reading between the lines, Fairfax came fully over to Monck's side and promised to raise Yorkshire in his name. On New Year's Day, Fairfax led a force of 1,800 supporters and besieged the city of York. Robert Lilburne had been placed in command of the city by Lambert and ordered to hold it for the junto. But, faced with dwindling support amongst his garrison, Lilburne surrendered York without a fight. Fairfax was instrumental to Monck's success, and particularly in averting violence on his march south. The men who had answered Fairfax's call were not all royalists, far from it. To quote from Austin Woolwich, Fairfax was able to, quote, embody the moderate parliamentary gentry's revolt against military tyranny without either scandalizing the army or creating a premature breach between Presbyterians and Commonwealth's men. So, the Irish reinforcements met with Fairfax on Marston Moor. They expressed their suspicions of Monck's intentions and tried to get Fairfax to put his name to a declaration against a government by single person. Fairfax took their statement and tore it up in front of them. As he made clear to Monck when the two met a few days later, he was for a free parliament, and upon the old foundation of monarchy. Monck himself made his way gradually south. Despite Speaker Lenthal writing and urging him to rush to the capital in case the junto caused trouble, Monck was relaxed. He enjoyed his triumphal march south. At every village and town he was greeted by ringing bells and cheering people. It's safe to say it was the best-received invasion from Scotland since the Second Bishops' War. His men were well-disciplined and well-supplied, and paid for what they needed, courtesy of the Scottish taxpayer. As they marched, Monck received an avalanche of petitions and grievances. Every one was different, but there were common threads. People, royalist and otherwise, wanted an end to high taxes. They wanted an end to military rule. They wanted a free and full parliament, the restoration of the MPs purged in 1648. Monck kept on writing his letters, maintaining his balancing act. He wrote to Republicans and to the Rump, reiterating his commitment to the Rump and the Republic and his dislike of monarchy. He also wrote to Royalists, who were getting a bit overexcited at these events, telling them off for getting ahead of themselves. The last thing he needed was a premature Royalist uprising which might spook the army and scuttle everything. He reached the outskirts of London at the end of January, and then Londoners were treated to another familiar sight, the army marching through the streets towards Whitehall. There was no outrage, or anger, or resistance, though. People lined the streets yelling for a free parliament. Monck was plainly dressed, but surrounded by 6,000 troops, and he met the aging William Lenthal. The two men embraced, and everything was outwardly pleasant. But despite Monck's repeated calls for parliamentary government, it was not the Rump Parliament he meant. Now he was in London with his army, the Republicans in the Rump began to realise that they had placed the future of the Republic in the hands of the wrong man. Somewhere, John Lambert might have shouted, "I told you so." When the Rump invited Monck into the chamber 2 days after his arrival, Monck began to strip away the illusions. First, he refused to take his seat, and then he refused to take his position on the Council of State because the Rump had made a condition that councillors swear an oath against the Stuart dynasty. Monck said he wasn't going to do that, and they should really get rid of all these oaths since they just make it harder to settle the country. Then, looking around the very empty chamber, he told them to hurry up and hold new elections to fill up their numbers. Then he left. Well, that was a tad ominous, but surely he's still our guy. The Rump then ordered Monck to show a display of loyalty. Since the Common Council elections in December, the City of London was becoming increasingly royalist. General Monck, as a good officer of the Republic, we want you to tear down the defences of the city, just in case. Monck then made a good show of how little he wanted to do this. He told the city councillors as much, and he ordered his men to only remove small things like fence posts and chains, and to leave the important defences like portcullises and gates in place. The Rump caught on to his reluctance pretty quickly, and repeated their order. Now, whether Monck wanted to show his hand yet, or saw that he could only drag this out for so much longer, he sent a letter to the Rump Parliament. Since they had such shoddy memories, he reminded them that it was only a few weeks earlier that they had been restored to power, and that was solely down to him and his army. He told them that they had a week to hold fresh elections, and that he was going to accept the Lord Mayor of London's invitation to live in the city. He was bringing a few thousand of his closest and most heavily armed friends along with him. The Rump then followed in another tradition of the many parliaments we've seen over the years. They declared that Parliament once again had complete and total authority over the army. Monck was no longer commander-in-chief and was just one of 5 members of a commission in charge of the military. But, and say it with me, Parliament could vote on whatever they wanted, the army was not listening to them. In the week after Monck effectively broke from the Rump, he was loving life. He was the darling of the City of London, and each night he was feasted by guilds and companies. But during the days, presumably dealing with hangovers, Monck consulted with both his officers and a large number of MPs who had been purged back in 1648. His officers were persuaded by Monck that it was vital for the settlement of the country for the secluded MPs to be allowed to sit. Now, the officers didn't like that. They were torn between their loyalty to Monck personally and their sympathy for the good old cause. These MPs had been purged for a reason, after all. But they begrudgingly accepted his argument, but insisted that the condition was, before they retook their seats, the returning MPs had to swear an oath to the Republic. Monck took these terms to a few of the MPs, who agreed, and promised to quickly call for new elections. On the 20th of February 1660, 73 purged MPs arrived outside of St. Stephen's Chapel. They demanded entry, as was their right as elected members of this Parliament, and they were escorted inside by Monck's red-coated soldiers. Rumpers like Arthur Hazelrig could only watch in horror as their minuscule numbers, around 20, were completely swamped by the returning MPs. Any objections to their agenda were simply outvoted. The Long Parliament was back, and the restored MPs followed through on their promise. The Long Parliament agreed that it had sat long enough. It was agreed that they would dissolve on the 16th of March, 1660. New elections for a free and unrestricted Parliament would be held. As Charles I had agreed, all the way back in 1641, Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. They hadn't given that consent at Pride's Purge, or when the army had expelled the Rump for the first time in 1653, or when it did so again in 1659. When it finally gave this consent in March 1660, it had been nearly 20 years since it had first sat. That is still, to this day, the longest-lasting Parliament in English, Scottish, Irish, or British history. To govern the country in the interim, a new Council of State was elected by the Long Parliament, with Monck, naturally, leading the polls. Monck continued to play his balancing act. even as the rump was diluted by the returning MPs. He had warned the MPs not to vote for a restoration of monarchy, and he repeatedly assured Republican civilians and soldiers like Arthur Haselrig and Colonel Oakey that he was not in favour of a return to monarchy. But his insistence was beginning to wear thin, and not just among the army and leading politicians. Samuel Pepys, of diary fame, started writing that diary on New Year's Day 1660, and though his career was on the rise, he was still a relative unknown. He is one of the many sources we have from ordinary people who describe the confusion which surrounded Monck's intentions. To quote from the diary, Pepys recorded that, quote, "Great is the talk of a single person, and that it would now be Charles, George, or Richard again. Charles Stuart, Richard Cromwell, or George Monck. These were the potential candidates for king." As February turned to March, the scepticism within the army towards Monck grew. Colonel Oakey presented a remonstrance to Monck signed by many junior officers which urged him to recognise the evils of a government led by a single man, and the danger this would pose to religious and civil liberties. He asked that Monck take this remonstrance and present it to the restored Parliament. Monck considered it, but refused. Instead, he told Oakey that the officers had to stop meeting in order to try and influence civilian politics. He did arrange an olive branch of a meeting between 10 officers and 10 MPs, where the army once again demanded that an Act of Indemnity be passed to legally protect them, come what may, as well as guaranteeing there would be no return to monarchy or a House of Lords. The MPs would not promise anything. They would not bind a future Parliament. Around this time, the civilian Republicans saw the writing on the wall and tried a desperate rearguard action. Haselrig and others told Monck that they realised that the Republic was not popular, because the people did not understand what was good for them. In which case, if the Republic was doomed, and a return to a single head of state was unavoidable, then it should be him. George Monck should be sovereign, whether that was a king, a Lord Protector, or some other title. The House of Stuart cannot come back. Monck essentially told them to get the hell out of his office. Quote, "I would rather be drawn in pieces with wild horses than be so treacherous to the nation." End quote. Now, the last Republican optimists could not ignore reality. Monck was not a friend of the Republic. Haselrig had a breakdown. His friends found him with his head in his hands, weeping and sobbing, "We are undone." But though the civilians may have given up, the army had not. Monck had hidden his intentions from his officers for good reason. There was a lot of sentiment against the return of monarchy, and there were 3 attempts by army officers to hold back the tide. The first came quickly after the restoration of the Long Parliament. Colonel Nathaniel Rich rode from London back to his regiment in East Anglia. He planned to make a last stand against the return of a king and use his regiment to rally resistance. But, like a carpenter building stairs, Monck had thought 2 steps ahead. When Colonel Rich reached his regiment, he found that it was no longer his regiment. Monck's replacement, Colonel Inglesby, had already arrived and taken over command. The rank and file fell behind their new commander, and Colonel Rich had to surrender. The second attempt was by Major General Overton, all the way up in Hull. Overton was a hardcore Republican, who in previous years had been imprisoned by Monck after he tried to launch a mutiny against the Protectorate. He'd been restored after the return of the Rump, and he'd been studiously neutral in the conflict between the junto and Monck. The two had met on Monck's southward march, and the meeting was all passive-aggressive barbed comments. But in March, Overton tried to build another conspiracy against Monck. He sent a letter to 3 colonels, complaining that Monck was clearly planning to restore the House of Stuart and seeking their support. But of course, someone talked. Someone always talks. And Overton really wasn't good at this conspiracy thing. All 3 of the colonels he'd reached out to were personal friends of George Monck, so of course they immediately informed him of the proposed treachery. Monck then wrote a letter to Overton, telling him that he knew what he tried to do, but that the army would not support him, and he was, of course, relieved from command. Overton's resolve crumbled, and he obediently returned to London. The third attempt was by none other than Major General John Lambert. Lambert had been arrested by the new Council of State and imprisoned in the Tower of London earlier in the year, but he'd escaped in April. Apparently he'd convinced the maid to swap places with him, wearing his nightcap and sleeping in his bed, as Lambert escaped down a rope to a waiting boat. Lambert then put out the call for all men loyal to the Commonwealth, the Republic, and the good old cause to meet him at Edge Hill, the only place more symbolic than Marston Moor, the site of Parliament's greatest victory, was Edge Hill, the site of the start of Parliament's struggle with the King 18 years before. And some did turn up. Colonel Oakey was one of them, as were some other colonels. But they came alone, or near enough. Colonel Inglesby went with a single squadron of cavalry to smother this last ember of resistance. Lambert was once again taken to the Tower of London, and he would never be free again. From March, Monck began indirect correspondence with Charles Stuart. Unlike the previous August, Monck was now willing to negotiate with the man who would be king. He couldn't do so openly, of course, so Monck sent a relative to meet with Charles's emissary, Sir John Grenville. Through this chain of people, Monck gave young Charles two things. The first was advice, rather sensible advice, that he probably shouldn't be in the territory of Catholic Spain if he was trying to negotiate his way back to England. It just didn't look good. Charles duly took the advice and moved to nearby Breda, in the Dutch provinces. This was in violation of the peace treaty, which ended the Anglo-Dutch War, but whether the Dutch cared at this point, or if Charles wasn't there long enough for anything to be done, I can't tell. If anyone has any idea about this, please do get in touch. The second thing Monck gave Charles Stuart was a bunch of conditions, 4 of them, which he would have to agree to if he wanted to return as king. The first was a general pardon. The second was his future consent for any acts of Parliament on land settlement. The third was to pay the soldiers' wages. And the fourth was liberty of conscience. Charles took this on board too, and on the 4th of April he published the Declaration of Breda. It looked like everything was lining up for a return to monarchy. The final gasp of Republican resistance came, of course, from the army. Pamphleteers and radicals were working the rank and file, and they had quite the effective message. If they were just going to let the king come back, then what had all this been for? Why had their friends and comrades died? And even if they didn't care about the past, where would this path lead them in the future? What if the returning king hanged them all as rebels, or transported them to the colonies? And of course, would he pay them what they were owed for serving another government? The radicals tried to revive the system of agitators, to whip up the army to send representatives to their leaders and fight for the return of the Republic. This was all far, far too late. A few days after he received Charles's declaration, Monck tightened his grip over the army. He imposed a humble remonstrance and address on his officers, which reiterated the importance of discipline, following the commands of Monck or the Council of State, and promising not to use petitions, declarations, or any other form of political mobilization to influence the government. The take-up of this latest remonstrance was widespread, and signatures came from garrisons all over the 3 kingdoms. But when pamphlets were still being distributed among the rank and file, Monck expanded the remonstrance to everyone in the army. This was a bridge too far for many of his officers. They had followed Monck through loyalty to him, but their deeper loyalty was to the Republic and the Commonwealth. They would not force their men to support a system they themselves didn't. Up to 30% of the cavalry resigned in protest, refusing to enforce the remonstrance when they fully understood what it would mean: the return of a king. It's quite striking that most of them were still owed a small fortune in back pay, and yet they gave this up and risked future persecution by a resurgent monarchy rather than betray their principles. It also meant that Charles's debt to buy back his kingdoms was just that little bit lighter. By the beginning of May, Monck had cleared the final obstacles for Charles Stuart's return. A new parliament had been elected on the 25th of April, the Convention Parliament, without any oaths of allegiance demanded. It also saw the return of the House of Lords. This was a heavily royalist parliament. One of its first acts was to declare that they were meeting under the authority of the king. On the 1st of May, the Declaration of Breda was read aloud to the House of Commons, to thunderous applause. On the 8th of May, the Convention Parliament voted that Charles Stuart had been king since the death of his father 11 years before. On the 2nd, Monck sent out copies of the Declaration of Breda and ordered that every officer sign that they welcomed it and that they would defend the true Protestant religion, the liberty and property of the people, the rights of Parliament, the laws of the land, and the honour and dignity of the king. Once enough of these signatures reached him, Monck sent word to Breda to inform Charles Stuart that both Parliament and the army were behind him, and invited him to come claim his thrones. Admiral Montague, along with Samuel Pepys, had been waiting on the warship the Naseby, now appropriately renamed the Royal Charles, and they set sail for Breda. They collected the young prince, or king, along with his brothers, James and Henry, the Dukes of York and Gloucester. It was an easy sailing, and Charles enjoyed one of the first and smallest benefits of his restoration, a new audience for the story of his escape from the Battle of Worcester. Pepys was apparently moved to tears. On the 25th of May, 1660, the royal party disembarked at Dover. Waiting to greet the new king was, of course, George Monck. Monck knelt and, in a theatrical display of contrition, begged Charles's forgiveness for his and the nation's sins. Charles, equally theatrically, though probably with a bit more sincerity, thanked Monck for saving the monarchy, calling him father. The party then rode to London in a mini royal progress, receiving the well wishes of every town and village they passed. They took their time so that Charles could re-enter London on the 29th of May, his 30th birthday. The city was an explosion of colour and noise, as citizens and aldermen and the city fathers all expressed how thankful they were for the king's return. At the centre of it all was the army. Regiment after regiment lined the procession, playing their drums and trumpets and holding out drawn swords. This was the same army which had led one king to the scaffold, and now it was welcoming his son. But it wasn't the same army, not really. 11 years was a long time. The army in 1660 had spent most of the last decade at peace, with little chance of promotion and an unclear reason for their existence. It had seen most of its officers become incredibly wealthy landowners who spent more time in their estates than with their regiments. It was also hard to ignore how deeply unpopular the army had become. It had lost the unity of purpose which had created the Putney debates, the General Council of the army, and which had fired the furnace of zeal. Once Monck had sidelined his opponents among the leading officers, a critical mass of the soldiers were willing to go along with any firm leadership which promised stability, indemnity, and pay. The question of what Monck wanted has been a live topic forever, and it still is. I'm convinced by the view of Ian Gentles that Monck had a plan and stuck to it, but other views are available. For example, Keay in The Restless Republic follows the line that Monck had been sincere in his loyalty to the Rump, but it had been the Rump's stubborn refusal to call new elections quickly which led to Monck losing faith. However, Gentles argues that Monck had been slowly detaching himself from the Rump Parliament since Booth's rebellion, when he didn't send troops to help. After his march on London, He could decide the future course of the three kingdoms through his military power. But Monck refused to use this power outright, and instead used it to push for a return of Parliament. He would make a deal with Charles Stuart, but only after Parliament had met and its intention to restore him to the throne was obvious. And I think Gentles lands on the crux of why it's so difficult to judge Monck's intentions here. What he'd told his officers back in Greyfriars Kirk was the truth. He did want to put civil power above the military. It just had to be the right civil power, one that had the legitimacy and authority to settle the country, and if it happened to bring back the king to do so, then so be it. He had his opinions, he preferred order and stability, he disliked political radicalism and despised religious radicalism. It just so happened that a restored Long Parliament, and any free and full Parliament which followed it, aligned with his views. Would Monck have stuck to his principle of civil authority above military if it hadn't? I don't know. And that is where we will end Season 3 of Pax Britannica. The king is back, long live the king. In Season 4, Charles II will come to three kingdoms which look very different to those his father had inherited. Even as the restored Stuarts tried to turn the clock back on many aspects of the Commonwealth, they will build on others, especially the formidable military machine. In Season 4, we will see the English Empire expand, the American colonies will grow in size and importance, and Jamaica will dislodge Barbados as the crown jewel of the Caribbean. We will see England enter the African slave trade on a level not seen before, and in Asia, the East India Company will gain its second major foothold in India, the islands of Bombay. But the growing English Empire will not go unchallenged by its European rivals or the American, African, and Asian societies it will push up against. Thank you so much for listening to Pax Britannica. Pax Britannica has been going for 6.5 years now. It's turned from a hobby I worked on when I was tired of my PhD to essentially a full-time job. Whether this is your first episode, if you started listening in Season 3, or you've been a listener for even longer, whether you're a current or former patron, or if you've never sent me a penny, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for letting me be part of your routine, for choosing Pax to liven up a boring commute, and for letting me tell you this fascinating, bizarre, terrible, and incredible history. It's the best job in the world. Season 4 will begin next week with the return of the king. And yes, I've been waiting to use that episode title for 6.5 years. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, the Duke of Hanson, Harold Hanson, the Marchioness of Windsor, Elizabeth Barrett, and the Earl of Pembroke, David Simpson. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.